And hi again. Okay, so today I'm going to discuss Mykeria with you, which I didn't have the chance to do last time because of how long Combat Suit Mercenaries took. So what I wanted to talk about is how Mykeria changed in the prototype that I've gave to you in regards to the one that I've shown in the initial videos. There aren't that many changes, there are really only two, but one of them is quite big. And that change is decreasing the amount of cult points for common cards. And this is because uh, I've decided that I don't want to introduce the rule that was in the original game, because that rule was kind of arbitrary, let's say, and the rule said that you could only sacrifice a card for cult points twice in a turn. This was because you could potentially win the game by only playing cards for cult points. I basically gave the cards too high numbers at the beginning when I tested the game, but I left it in at that time because I thought that this solution that you can only do it twice in a turn would be enough. Well, that and the fact that otherwise spending the lowest cards, the cards that are worth two cult points, spending them for one cult point isn't really much of a solution. I mean, it's not a very good thing to do. It's not a very good move to do. But I decided to decrease the amounts anyway because over the years, I found that I really dislike when a game has these arbitrary rules that are there just as a guard against certain ways a player can play. What I prefer is not limiting the player in this artificial way, but rather creating a whole game in a way that allows the player to play without any strange restrictions, but rather just using whatever he has. So that's one change. So now you can spend any amount of cards you wish on cult points during a turn. And that shouldn't make you win the game because the amount of cult points you get has been reduced. So you're still better off playing those cards as per usual, and spending them for cult points is just a safety net if you have nothing to do with that card. So, for example, you've got a Schism card, but there are no priests in the game, so you wouldn't normally use that card, but now you can get 3 points, I believe, for it. So that's always something, right? Okay, so that's that. And the other small change that I made was switching the order of two Boguhar cards. The Boguhar cards have a interesting history behind them because initially in the first prototype this game had a mechanic in which you could attack like in Magic the Gathering, or you could deal damage, and one of the ways you dealt damage was by sacrificing your units to basically just take care of other units, of other players' units. I found that this mechanic didn't really work all that well because of how important it is that you keep your followers growing. So, sacrificing your followers is actually quite a big deal because you may not be able to get those back. And so, a common card which allowed that was thrown out of the game, and the only god that still had those kinds of cards was Boguhar, the god of war, obviously. The two the highest initiative cards of Boguhar, the 5 and the 6, they've got that ability that you have to sacrifice one of your followers to do something to the other player. And I never was quite sure which card should be where. I mean, how powerful they were in, like, when you compare the two, which one is the most powerful and therefore should be this one step higher, well, lower on the initiative. So it should have a 5 instead of a 6. Right now, I've switch those in the prototype that I've given to you, and I think that's going to be a better solution, so we'll see how that goes. Okay, so a little bit about Combat Suit Mercenaries. I promised you that I would tell you something about the tests we've run on Saturday. We've run a single game, which lasted around 4 hours, which was far too long. Well, technically 3 hours, because we spent a lot of time introducing the game and concepts, but 3 hours is still way too long. What I want this game to be is a 2 hour tops experience. I don't expect it's going to be shorter than 90 minutes because it's quite a big game. Though if I manage to do that, I will. If everything else is going to work as well as it does now, or as well as I would like it to work, and I'll be able to make the game 90 minutes, I probably will, because I prefer shorter games to longer ones. But I think that to combat so that the game feels like a proper epic experience, it should last about 2 hours, and that's what I'm probably going to be aiming at. So I've gotten some very interesting feedback. I haven't played the game myself. I was watching the 4 players that I invited playing it, and I sometimes like to do that. I sometimes like to test the game myself, but usually looking at what the other players do is quite enough for me to see where the game has some rough edges that need to be polished. And so I've had a lot of good feedback from those players. Most importantly, it seems that the combat system works, but I have to take out enemy tactics for now. As you could see in the previous video, when you fight an NPC, you draw an enemy tactics card, and those tactics were quite fun, but they allowed the combat to be very random. And I feel like it's random enough with the different NPC abilities and how they work together, depending on what kind of hand of enemies you draw. And it becomes later on when you draw 3 enemies instead of 2. So when you basically just level up for the first time, you start drawing 3 enemies, and the addition of that enemy tactic makes things quite complicated. So I will be removing it for the next tests, and I'll see how that works. That's one change. The other thing is shortening how long it takes to level up. When we finished the game, one of the players who had the most experience points from 1 battles was only about halfway through the entire track. So that's not really what I wanted from the game. And barely any elite enemies came around. Actually, only 1 elite enemy came around, and that's because an tactics card made them to appear. But basically, we didn't have any combat with elite enemies. That's something that I want to fix. So initially, what we tested was you had 2 separate actions. One of them was called the Academy, the other the Armory. And if you went to the Armory, you could do stuff with combat suits, buy a combat suit, repair it, buy stuff for it. Or you could go to the Academy and do stuff connected with your tactics, doctrines, and pilots. One of the players suggested that we merge that, and I think that's a great idea. We're going to be merging that so that you can you pick 3 things. When you pick an action, a purchase action basically, you do 3 things, and those 3 things can be done in the Armory or in the Academy. And it doesn't matter, you can do 3 things basically. So that's what we're going to try out. It should make buying stuff flow much better, and that's something that I think is very important at this point. And it's also going to allow players to equip their combat suits the moment that they have the ability to do so. Previously, you would have to spend 2 actions to just have a combat suit and then a pilot, but right now you'll be able to buy a pilot, buy a combat suit, and equip the combat suit in a single action, and that should make things much better for the players. The biggest question right now is how to resolve the main board, and that's something that I still haven't figured out, but I will be trying a different approach. The approach we had right now was that depending on what family controlled territory, they would get different kinds of points. They would get more or less points depending on the amount of amount of locations they control. So what we're going to try is something a little bit different, similar to how it's done in another game by Eric M. Lang, Chaos in the Old World. And in Chaos in the Old World, at some point, some spaces on the game on the board just close, and you can't do anything more with them. I'm going to try a similar approach. So the moment that an area is uncontested, so you've got 5 influence points from one of the families, which they get by winning battles, you'll just close that location, and the first family that has 4 locations closed down wins the game. But the locations can also be opened if they are called by an event card. And the event cards at this point are probably going to leave the game as well. And what I'm going to do instead is introducing dice into the game, which is very unfamiliar for me and very weird for my design for it to have dice. But in this case, I feel comfortable that it's not going to make the game too random. If it does, I'll just return to the cards because I still have them. It's just that 2/3 of the cards won't be used, so I don't see a reason to confuse the players by showing them a card which has a lot of content on it, but tell them that they only have to care about top content. So that doesn't make much sense, and I don't want to create new cards just with 4 numbers on them. So I think that 4 10-sided dice should do the trick. We'll see how it goes when we test the game out next week. Next Saturday, I'm holding this small board up meeting of my friends, and I'm going to ask some of them to sit down to a game of Combat Suit Mercenaries, probably with me, and I'll see how it goes. I hope that the changes that I'm going to make are going to make the game much better. And so we're closing this design diary, and I hope to see you next time. Thanks for listening, and if you haven't already, please check out my Patreon and see if what I do interests you, and if yes, I would really like to receive some of your support. Thanks a lot.